Let's do some benchmarking. This is the MSI Gaming X Trio RTX 4070 Ti, and this one right here is the MSI Gaming X Trio RTX 4090. They are vastly different in pricing, but some of their capabilities are very similar. So let's see what this does in things like Blender Benchmark or Puget Benchmark for DaVinci Resolve. And this is also a 7950X, 16 cores, 32 threads, 64 gigs of Kingston Fury DDR5 RAM, and this is ran by the MSI, if you can focus man, MSI Meg AI 1300P PCI Gen 5.0 power supply unit in the Thermaltake distro case 350p. First up for the 4090, we're going to run Blender Benchmark, and we'll be monitoring the temperatures in Hardware Info 64. Blender Benchmark is a great way to really press a GPU to see its full capabilities, and the DDR5 RAM is actually 6,000 megatransfers. The benchmark is completed, and when that happens, you just click on Submit Results, and it gave a score of 12,105, and that's actually so good, it's in the top 0% of all benchmarks, so it's off the chart, basically. Next up is Puget Benchmark for DaVinci Resolve, and on this system it's actually DaVinci Resolve Studio 18.1.3. So we're going to go ahead and run this, and this will take roughly 10 to 15 minutes. Today's cell phones like the Samsung Galaxy S22 Ultra or the Z Fold 4 have excellent cameras, so people are filming a lot more using these rather than pocket cameras like this. Unless you're a professional, then you're going to have something really serious. So a benchmark like this for DaVinci Resolve and how well it will edit footage that is just native to these devices is really nice. So how well will a 4090 do versus a 4070 Ti? Also with DaVinci Resolve Studio 18, it does utilize a GPU very nicely, and actually multiple GPUs. If you don't have the Studio version, it's actually going to use the CPU a lot more. And here we have the scores for Puget Bench for DaVinci Resolve, 4K Media Score, GPU Effects Score, and Fusion Score. So we're going to write those down and move on. 3D Mark is an excellent benchmark to run to get a general understanding of how well a system will perform in particular games. Port Royal, for example, is heavily for ray tracing. So we're going to go through a couple of these, write down the scores, and then move on to the 4070 Ti in white. The first one is definitely going to be Port Royal. So this is heavily focused on ray tracing. And in this benchmark, the 4090 is maxing out at about 71.5 degrees Celsius, while being very nice and quiet. We got our Port Royal score, and it actually is better than 94% of all results, so not too bad at all. 3D Mark does add benchmarks every now and then. This new one is Speedway, so let's go ahead and check this one out. And it actually says this is the Speedway interactive mode. Explore the scenes with free movement and change the lighting and camera focus settings. So this is actually quite nice and interesting. The display I'm using here for these benchmarks is the HP Omen 27U. So it's a 4K 144Hz display. I'm definitely loving this display. It's one of my favorites that I use for benching and just personal gaming. So again, this is a DirectX 12 style of benchmark, and they did a really good job on this. You can really see the detail that they've put in all the different lighting, effects, shadows. Quite a nice benchmark. It's definitely a bit heavy on the CPU side, as the temperatures got over 90 degrees on the 7950X. The target is actually 95 degrees for the 7950X, so the custom water cooling is actually keeping it below that target, which is nice. And the GPU temperature for that was 66 degrees Celsius, not too bad. And this is the score for Speedway. The DirectX ray tracing feature test is basically about pure ray tracing performance. This is definitely a different style of test since it's just primarily focused on ray tracing. This is one of those features for NVIDIA where if you have a game that's not performing all that well, but it is compatible with DLSS, you can actually get a huge boost in frame rate. And it does this test in a couple of parts. The first part is without DLSS to actually get a benchmark, and then the second part will have it. You'll notice the frame rate right there, about 58, 60 FPS. This is without it. And honestly, it still looks amazing. I would love to play a game that looks this good. And now we have DLSS on, and you can see the frame rate has skyrocketed. We're at 180 FPS before we were at about 60. So it definitely gives a noticeably smoother experience. And it's hard to argue that DLSS is something that many people may want. Some people call DLSS fake frames, but hey, fake it till you make it, I guess, because yeah, this looks really good. So you can always check the websites like NVIDIA's just to see a list of compatible games for DLSS. And here we go, with DLSS off, the average frame rate was 56.78 and DLSS on 176.44. So we already know that the 4090 by MSI here, the Gaming X Trio, is going to give us some spectacular results. So now it's time to install this White 4070Ti by MSI, also a Gaming X Trio. I did notice that the 4090 was spectacular with its noise levels. The fans were barely spinning. It was just enough to pretty much keep it cool. So a lot of the temperatures were around 60 to say 65 degrees Celsius throughout all of these benchmarks, which is spectacular. This 4070 Ti is massive with its heat sinks, and it has 6 heat pipes going through it as well. So I'm expecting similar noise levels, which were basically non-existent. Let's get to it. So we have the MSI Gaming X Trio RTX 4070 Ti installed, and we're starting the benchmarks right now. The first one is Blender benchmark. While running Blender benchmark, we've topped out at 204 watts used by the GPU so far, with a maximum temperature in Blender of 68 degrees Celsius. Looks like we have our scores. Time to submit. And we're at a benchmark score of 7,270. And again, that puts us in the top 0% of all benchmarks, so it's not even on the charts. Puget benchmark is up next for DaVinci Resolve, and after that, it'll be the 3D Mark benchmarks, and then we'll just go ahead and do our conclusion. So all of our benchmarks are done with the 4090 and 4070 Ti, both by MSI Gaming X Trio. So this is a nice way to understand the real differences between these two models because they're the same manufacturer. And I definitely like the look of both of these as well. That's subjective, obviously, but the results kind of speak for themselves. So with all the benchmarks that we ran, the Puget benchmark for DaVinci Resolve, all of the 3D Mark benchmarks, and the Blender benchmark as well, the average difference was about a 33% hit in terms of a lower performance with the 4070 Ti compared to the 4090. Now, is that a big deal or not? Well, it depends on what the current pricing is when you're watching this video, because GPU prices all over the place, so it makes no sense for me today to actually say, hey, this is a good buy or this is a horrible buy, because a week from now, things could be very, very different. But we can see that it's really based on what you're using your PC for to determine if it makes sense for getting a 4070 Ti over a 4090 or vice versa. One thing that did really impress me with all of these benchmarks is DLSS. DLSS is definitely in its infancy stages, but it's spectacular the way it is right now. So for the 4090, it went from 56 FPS with it being off to a whopping 176 FPS with DLSS on, and it looked almost exactly the same. I had to really kind of like pixel peep to kind of determine a little bit of some artifacting or whatever you want to call it for the appropriate term of having DLSS. But basically it's kind of fake frames. And when I'm just kind of sitting back and enjoying it, I didn't see any difference. And for the 3070 Ti, the difference was huge. So you're talking 30 FPS with DLSS being off, but then when it got turned on for the benchmark, 106 FPS. That is a humongous gain in not only perceivable difference in gameplay, but just percentage-wise as well. So this is something that is a great technology that NVIDIA is putting out. More and more games are going to be DLSS compatible, so keep an eye out on that. And then, of course, when it came to the Blender benchmark, there was a 40% dip in performance between a 4070 Ti and a 4090. So if you're into Blender, the 4090 may be the way to go. Another large dip in performance was Port Royal. Obviously, that's a big, huge one. Another one, Firestrike, that benchmark, as well as the new one, Speedway. Those were both over 44 and 46% dips in performance for the 4070 Ti. The Puget Fusion benchmark. So the 4070 Ti only performs 6% slower than the 4090. So depending on what you're doing in DaVinci Resolve, especially if you're using that aspect of it, why get a 4090 if you can save a ton of money and just get a 4070 Ti? But on the flip side, for the GPU effects of DaVinci Resolve, you definitely see a 43% dip in performance getting a 4070 Ti versus the 4090. So again, it really depends on what you're using your PC for. So I hope that this was an informative session for you. I definitely love running these benchmarks. Let me know if there's other GPUs that are out right now or coming out that you'd like me to run some similar benchmarks for. I like these real world tests. Now, when it comes to specific games, there's a long list of games and a long list of settings in each game. That's why I don't really run too many gaming benchmarks, because 3D Mark, it standardizes everything. It doesn't matter about your internet connection, doesn't matter about your in-game settings. This is something that you can run at home. You can run the Puget benchmark at home as well. You can run the Blender benchmark at home to really compare your systems to what these GPUs are doing, and CPUs and RAM and all that stuff. So thank you for watching. Let me know in the comment sections what you thought, if you want to see more videos like this. And if you like this, hit that like button. Feel free to subscribe. More to come. Thank you very much for watching. Peace.